A humble janitor, overlooked by all, single-handedly saved a $1 billion deal. She was just a quiet woman of color, invisible in the eyes of the powerful. But in a moment of unexpected courage, she spoke the truth that no one else dared to say, changing everything. Hannah, what did she see that others couldn't? It was a day like any other, one marked by the humdrum of luxury and power, where the air was thick with ambition and quiet arrogance. The Westwood Hotel, with its polished floors and glass walls, stood like a cathedral of wealth. A temple for the successful, the influential, a place where names held weight, where the currency of connection was the only thing that truly mattered. And in one of its grandest rooms, a scene was unfolding that would soon tear at the fabric of societal pretenses, exposing the ugliness beneath the carefully curated surfaces. The conference room was vast, its long white table a stark, immovable entity at the center. It stretched like an altar laden with folders, contracts, and financial papers, the sacred texts of the business world. John Walker, the CEO of Pinnacle Investments, sat at one end. His sharp suit, a tailored masterpiece, reflected the precision with which he ran his empire. But his fingers, clenched beneath the table, told a different story. His thoughts were elsewhere, consumed by the enormity of the $1 billion deal that teetered on the edge of collapse. Across from him sat the Sadiq Kadir Al-Hamid, the billionaire leader of the Abu Dhabi National Investment Fund. His presence was overwhelming, not because of his size, but because of the cold, iron resolve that emanated from him like an invisible force. His eyes, dark and impenetrable, moved slowly over the room, calculating, weighing, considering. His wealth was not just in the numbers on paper, but in the depth of his silence. The stakes of the deal were monumental. The $1 billion at hand was not just a number. It was a dream for 5 Manhattan neighborhoods, a transformation that would bring the future of sustainable development into the present. Walker had spent months preparing, exhausting his resources on lawyers, interpreters, and all the tools he thought necessary to secure this deal. But now in this room, the walls felt like they were closing in. He could sense the collapse, a slow, inevitable disintegration of everything he had worked for. The air was thick, oppressive. The Sadiq's voice, when it came, was sudden. He broke the silence, switching abruptly to rapid-fire Arabic. The room jolted, like a flash of lightning that struck without warning, and the tension hung in the air like an electric charge. Peter Erickson and Mark Hunt, the 2 interpreters Walker had flown in from Washington, exchanged a brief, panicked glance. They had prepared for everything, except this. Despite their years of experience, this was no ordinary conversation. This was high-stakes business, interwoven with cultural and financial nuances that they were struggling to untangle. Walker leaned forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He needed answers. The future of Pinnacle depended on it. "Peter, Mark," he barked. "What's he saying? We need to know." Sweat beaded on Peter's forehead, his voice faltering. "Sir, it's too fast, too technical. We can't keep up. He's disputing Section 207, but we can't pinpoint exactly what his objections are." Anger swelled in Walker's chest. These were supposed to be the experts, the ones who would ensure that this moment didn't slip away. And yet here they were, caught in the crossfire of their own inadequacy. Meanwhile, Sadiq Kadir's voice rose, the sharp cadence of his words echoing off the walls. His hand slammed against the table, a signal that the negotiations had reached a breaking point. His advisors nodded, exchanging looks of impatience, and the room was filled with whispers in Arabic. A flurry of voices that only deepened the uncertainty. Walker felt helpless, a feeling he had long since forgotten. He had led his company to the top, had weathered countless storms, but this moment, this impasse, was different. The Sadiq was losing patience, and the $1 billion was slipping away, not because of the money, but because of a failure to communicate. And then it happened. A small, unremarkable figure emerged from the periphery of the room. Jessica Brown, a young black waitress, stood by the door, her tray of coffee cups in her hands, her face composed, her movements fluid. To the men in the room, she was nothing. Just a waitress, a fixture in the background, one who brought the coffee, cleared the cups, and remained invisible. But Jessica was watching, listening, observing. For 3 days, she had been in this room, filling the cups, arranging the snacks, hearing everything that passed between these men, these giants of business. She understood the weight of this deal, understood the words that hung in the air, and more importantly, understood the mistake that had set everything in motion. The Sadiq was wrong. It was a simple miscommunication, a mistake born of cultural differences and legal terminology. One that could be corrected, but she knew that if it wasn't addressed, everything would crumble. Her heart pounded in her chest as she set the coffee pot down quietly, a soft clink against the table. She took a deep breath, then stepped forward, her voice steady, clear, and unexpected. "Your Highness Sadiq Kadir," she said, her Arabic flawless. "If I may, I believe I know where this misunderstanding comes from." The room fell into stunned silence. Every eye turned toward her, wide with disbelief. No one spoke. Not Walker, not Tucker, not the interpreters, and certainly not the Sadiq. Only Jessica stood, her small figure unwavering amidst the sea of powerful men, her calm demeanor speaking volumes. She had crossed a line. She knew it. The consequences could be severe, but she was driven by something deeper, a sense of justice, of dignity, of a truth that could no longer be ignored. Jessica's words hung in the air like a prayer, silent and powerful, demanding attention. Every person in that room, the executives, the billionaires, the interpreters, were forced to listen. They had underestimated her, ignored her, dismissed her as invisible. And now here she was, the one person who could see the problem, the one person who could fix it. She waited. The weight of the moment was upon her, but she didn't flinch. And for the first time, Jessica wasn't just a waitress. She wasn't just the person who brought coffee. She was the only one in that room who understood what was at stake. The silence in the room was deafening, a thick blanket of disbelief settling over everyone. John Walker, his usual demeanor of control and confidence shattered, sat back in his chair. He had never imagined the day would come when a woman, a black woman, standing in the corner, would be the one to break the impasse. Jessica Brown, in her crisp uniform, stood there as though the weight of the world rested on her small shoulders. Raymond Tucker, the executive vice president of Pinnacle Investments, was the first to recover from the shock. But his recovery was not one of respect or acknowledgment. His eyes narrowed, and his lips curled into a dismissive sneer. His voice was clipped, dripping with condescension as he spoke. Miss Brown, I think it's time for you to return to your duties. This is not a place for suggestions. You're out of your depth." His words hit the room like a slap. Jessica could feel the eyes of the men on her, some with skepticism, others with outright disdain. She knew what they were thinking. She knew what the barriers were, the weight of history, of their upbringing, of their prejudices. It was all right there, laid bare in the coldness of Tucker's words. But Jessica didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She had already learned that to flinch was to admit weakness. And weakness was something she had long since shed. Turning to face Tucker, her voice unwavering. She responded. I understand your doubts, Mr. Tucker, but I'm not here to please you. I'm here to do what's right for this deal. She met his gaze, a gaze that had long been accustomed to dismissing people like her. "Hi, and if you'll listen, I'll explain why you're wrong." There was a moment of tension, a quiet that seemed to stretch out forever. Then, as if in slow motion, the Sadiq's voice cut through the thick air. "Let her speak," he said, his deep voice carrying an authority that made the rest of the room pause. Jessica looked up, meeting the Sadiq's gaze. No, and she saw something there that no one else had seen: respect. He wasn't looking at her with the dismissive air of those who saw only her job title, her race, or her gender. He was looking at her with the sharp focus of someone who recognized competence when it appeared. She inhaled deeply, gathering the courage to move forward, knowing that this was no longer about the deal alone. This was about something much bigger. Something that had been simmering inside her for years. A fight for dignity, for her place in the world, for the opportunity to be seen, for her mind, her ability, not her skin. "I've been listening carefully," she began, her voice calm yet laced with authority. "The mistake is in the translation of section 7. The wording you've been using suggests that Pinnacle wants to seize absolute control, which is not what the contract stipulates. There's a crucial nuance in the translation of terms. Voting preference rights is versus why absolute voting control. These are not the same thing. This misunderstanding is what's causing the tension." She paused, watching the room absorb her words. It wasn't just the words that held them. It was the calm certainty in her voice. The unshakable confidence that came from years of understanding, of hard-earned knowledge. Tucker's face reddened. His jaw clenched as his pride, wounded and bruised, struggled to suppress the growing anger inside him. His fingers twitched, as though itching to make an accusation, to tear her down again, but something stopped him. The silence had grown deeper, more profound. As though the room itself had turned its gaze upon him, daring him to challenge her once more. The Sadiq, still observing Jessica with a watchful eye, leaned forward slightly, his voice low but firm. "You are correct," he said, his words hanging in the air like a seal on her statement. "This misunderstanding could have been avoided with better clarity, but it seems we have now come to the crux of the matter." Jessica stood there, her heart thudding in her chest. But her face remained composed, like the still surface of a lake. She knew that in this moment she wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a financial expert. She was a voice of reason in a room full of men who had believed their power was unassailable, their judgment Walker, who had remained quiet until now, turned to face Jessica with a mixture of respect and skepticism. Whoa. He was beginning to see her differently, to understand that she had more than just a passing knowledge of the deal. She understood the intricacies of global finance, the culture of Gulf investments. The very things he thought only experts could grasp. "Miss Brown," he said, his voice laced with hesitation. You say you understand this deal. Tell us then, what would your solution be? How can we ensure this misunderstanding doesn't jeopardize the deal?" Jessica's eyes met his, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his gaze. Not just the sharp, calculating businessman he had been moments before, but a flicker of something softer. Regret, recognition, she couldn't quite tell, but she knew that the room was no longer looking at her with disdain. They were looking at her with expectation. "My solution," she said, slowly, carefully, "is to adjust the language in the contract. Instead of suggesting Pinnacle's control, we need to specify that voting preference rights are contingent upon mutual agreement. There will be no unilateral decisions. Both parties must agree before any major action is taken." She paused, allowing the words to sink in. The Sadiq nodded slightly, signaling her to continue. "Furthermore," she added, "we need to address the governance structure. A joint oversight committee would help ensure that both parties remain equally invested in the project's success. And any decision requiring an adjustment of equity would need to be approved by both sides, not just one. This gives both parties a sense of security." The room was silent again. For the first time, Jessica felt the weight of her words settle in. This was her moment. This was the moment she had fought for, not just in this room, but in the quiet struggles of her life. "Tucker," still simmering with anger, opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the Sadiq raised his hand. "Enough," he said. "This matter is settled. I agree with Miss Brown's assessment. We will proceed under these terms." There was no applause, no grand gestures, but Jessica felt a shift in the room, a shift she had fought for her entire life. She had made herself seen, not through demands, not through pleas, but through the undeniable force of her knowledge, her skill, and her courage. The moment lingered like the fading echo of a storm, heavy and still. The room, once taut with tension, was now marked by an unspoken shift. Jessica could feel the change, subtle yet undeniable. She wasn't just a part of the conversation anymore. She was now a force to be reckoned with. And that force had not been born in boardrooms or conference calls. It had been forged in the years of struggle, in the quiet, lonely nights when her dreams felt as distant as the stars. For the first time, Jessica felt the gaze of the men around her, no longer clouded by their prejudices. The walls that had once seemed insurmountable, the barriers of race and class, had cracked open, even if only slightly. But she knew that this moment, this victory, was just the beginning. The room had shifted, but the world? It would take much more than a moment to change that. As the Sadiq made his agreement, Jessica felt the weight of his words settle over her like a warm blanket. She had never imagined that she would hear the words of respect from someone of his stature. But there was no time for reflection, no room to rest on her laurels. This battle was not yet over, and the fight for recognition was far from won. Walker, who had remained largely silent since Jessica's intervention, now turned his full attention toward her. His face, usually so composed and guarded, was softened by something resembling genuine admiration. It wasn't a look of patronizing pity, nor was it a fleeting gesture of gratitude. There was something deeper there, a recognition of the value Jessica had brought to the table, not as a token of goodwill, but as a person who had transformed the course of an entire negotiation. "Miss Brown," he said slowly, his voice almost reverent, "what you've done here today is remarkable. You've saved this deal, and for that I can't thank you enough." Jessica nodded, her expression calm, but her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the room's gaze on her, each pair of eyes assessing her, measuring her worth. But there was something in Walker's voice that made her pause. It wasn't the praise. She had heard plenty of hollow praise in her life. It was the sincerity. For the first time, she felt like someone saw her not for the color of her skin, or the job she had been relegated to, but for the depth of her knowledge, for the merit she had earned through hard work and perseverance. But even as Walker spoke, Tucker's presence loomed like a shadow in the corner of the room. His face was pale, his eyes narrowed in simmering resentment, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that the veins in his hands stood out like ropes of anger. It was clear to everyone in the room that this defeat, this public humiliation, had not settled well with him. Jessica could almost feel his hatred burning, the bitterness seeping out like poison. Tucker was not the type of man who would accept defeat gracefully. His pride was too great, and his arrogance too rooted in the walls of the world he had built around himself. But Jessica, for once, didn't feel the need to fear him. She could see the cracks in his facade, the way his mask of superiority was slipping. Still, she knew this wouldn't be the last of him. No, Tucker would continue to challenge her, to chip away at her confidence, trying to find any way to bring her back into the shadows where he felt most comfortable. But for now, in this moment, Jessica had won, and that victory, even if only temporary, was enough to sustain her. Walker's voice broke through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. "We need to move forward," he said, his voice firm now, no longer uncertain. "Let's revisit the terms and finalize this agreement." The meeting continued, the room now a battlefield of ideas, numbers, and power plays. Power play. Yet Jessica remained at the center of it all. She had proven herself, not just to the Sadiq, but to everyone in the room. She was no longer the invisible woman standing in the corner. No, she was the one whose words carried weight, whose voice could change the direction of this multi-billion-dollar deal. But even as the conversation turned back to the details of the contract, Jessica felt her mind wandering. She thought about her journey, about the days spent in the shadows, serving coffee and bearing the weight of the world's prejudices on her shoulders. She thought about her father, the man who had given everything for his family, only to be crushed by the weight of the world's indifference. She could still feel the sting of that loss, the way his death had torn her apart, leaving her with nothing but the fragments of a life she had once imagined. But she had survived, and in surviving, she had become something more, something that no one in this room, not Tucker nor anyone else, could take from her. The conversation in the room continued to flow around her, but Jessica's focus sharpened. She was no longer just a participant. She was a force, a presence that commanded attention. She had earned her place at this table, and no one could take that from her. Not Tucker, not the prejudices of the world, not even her own fears. When the meeting finally broke, Jessica remained seated for a moment, watching as the others filed out of the room. She had done it. She had fought for herself, for her family, and for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. It was a victory that would be felt for years to come, a quiet revolution that had begun with a single act of courage. And as she walked out of the room, her steps felt lighter, her heart stronger. The world had changed, at least for her. The lobby of the Westwood Hotel, with its high ceilings and polished marble floors, seemed to stretch out before Jessica like a distant horizon. The conversations of the departing guests buzzed in the background. Their laughter and small talk oblivious to the quiet storm that had just passed through the conference room. She walked with a steady rhythm, her steps purposeful but slow, as if she was still absorbing the enormity of what had just unfolded. For a moment, she allowed herself the luxury of reflection. She thought of the years she had spent fighting for a seat at the table, of the countless doors that had closed in her face, of the way her skin had always been a barrier, a first judgment before her qualifications were even considered. And yet here she was. She had fought with more than just her intellect. She had fought with every ounce of her being, with the weight of all the years of invisible labor that had brought her here. She knew, however, that the victory was not one of finality. Tucker would not let go so easily. There was no doubt in her mind that he would seek to undermine her, to chip away at her every achievement, to dismiss her at every turn. But Jessica wasn't afraid. The fear that had once haunted her, the constant worry of being overlooked, of being diminished, had dissipated in that room. It was replaced by something more powerful, certainty. And yet, as she walked through the hotel's vast corridor, something else tugged at her heart, something she couldn't shake. She had won, yes, but at what cost? The world had seen her, finally. But the people she had once admired, the ones who had treated her as nothing more than a servant, now looked at her through a different lens. She could feel their eyes on her, the respect, but also the unease. They had never expected her to rise. She stopped at the window, gazing out over the bustling cityscape. The skyline of Manhattan, a testament to wealth and power, seemed so distant now. She had once longed for this kind of recognition, but now that it was within her grasp, she wondered if it was enough. Would it be enough to heal the wounds she had carried for so long? Behind her, the sound of footsteps drew nearer. It was Emily, the young white colleague who had shown Jessica nothing but kindness. In the days following her arrival at the Westwood Hotel, Emily had always been different from the others. Her gaze not tainted by the same biases that had clouded the eyes of everyone else in this building. "Jessica," Emily called out, her voice light, as if unsure how to address the gravity of the moment. "Are you okay?" Jessica turned slowly, her gaze meeting Emily's with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady, though her heart was not. "Just thinking." Emily nodded, stepping closer, her expression sincere. "I can't imagine what you're feeling right now." You've done something incredible today. But I can also see that it's not just the deal you're worried about. Jessica smiled, but it was a smile tinged with sadness. You're right, it's not just about the deal. She paused, her thoughts drifting for a moment before she continued. It's about everything that led up to this moment. The years of being invisible, the years of being told that I wasn't enough, that I wasn't worthy. Emily's eyes softened, and for the first time Jessica saw something real in her gaze. It wasn't sympathy, it wasn't pity, it was understanding. And that understanding made Jessica feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. I don't think anyone can understand what you've been through, Jessica, Emily said softly. But I want you to know that I see you, I see your strength, and I'm proud of you. I'm proud to know you. Jessica's chest tightened, and for a brief moment, the walls she had built around herself, the walls that had been constructed from years of fighting and surviving, began to crumble. But she held them together, not because she was afraid to let go, but because she knew that the world was still full of people like Tucker. People who would never truly understand her journey, her struggle, her fight. Thank you, Jessica replied, her voice low. That means more to me than you know. Emily stepped closer, hesitating for a moment before reaching out and giving Jessica a gentle hug. The gesture, simple yet powerful, was a reminder that even in the darkest corners of the world, there were people who would stand beside you, who would help you carry the weight of it all. As they pulled apart, Jessica's mind returned to the room where the negotiation had taken place. She thought about Walker, about the way his gaze had softened when he looked at her, and about the respect that had finally begun to form in his eyes. But she knew that it wasn't just about Walker. It was about everyone who had ever doubted her, everyone who had looked at her and seen only the surface. The moment she stepped into that room, she had not just fought for a seat at the table, she had fought for her place in the world. And in doing so, she had become something else entirely. Someone who would no longer be silenced. Jessica turned back to the window, her gaze sweeping over the city below. The battle was far from over, she knew. There would be more moments like this, moments where the fight would be quieter, more insidious, but no less important. But for now, she had won, and in this moment that was enough. Jessica stepped away from the window and out of the quiet of her thoughts, though the silence in the hotel lobby had grown thick, pressing in on her chest. She had spent so many years trying to be seen, but even now, after the events of the meeting, there was a part of her that felt the weight of doubt. Doubt about how far she had truly come, about how much of the world had shifted, and about how much was still hidden beneath the surface. She had claimed victory in the conference room, yes, but she knew, as all too many know, that the battle against prejudice doesn't end with a single act of courage or an isolated triumph. There was always the next moment, the next hurdle. In her case, that moment was just around the corner, lurking in the form of Raymond Tucker. As she walked through the hallways of the Westwood Hotel, her heels clicking against the marble floors. Jessica's thoughts circled back to him. Tucker, with his unyielding arrogance, had been one of the first to dismiss her. He was the embodiment of everything she had fought against, a man whose privilege and ego defined him, whose position in this world made him feel as if the game of life had already been won before it even started. But today, she had done something remarkable. She had stood her ground and corrected a critical error, all the while holding her own against a room full of men who were quick to dismiss her. Tucker, however, had yet to accept the truth. She could feel it in the way he had looked at her, in the coldness of his eyes. He would never be able to accept that a woman like her, a black woman no less, could outshine his expertise. The thought of him and his disdain made her chest tighten, but she pushed it aside. She had to. There were other things to focus on now. When she reached the elevator, she paused. The hotel's opulence suddenly felt suffocating. The lavish lobby, the gleaming marble floors, the quiet hum of wealthy patrons. It all seemed so far removed from the world she had come from. Jessica closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts before she stepped into the elevator. The doors slid shut, and for a moment, she was alone. But as the elevator began its slow ascent, she found herself reflecting on something deeper, something she had been pushing down to the back of her mind ever since her father's passing, the weight of responsibility that she had carried ever since her family's collapse. Her father's death had been the catalyst, the turning point that sent her life spiraling in directions she hadn't planned. It had forced her back to the United States, away from the promising future she had been building in Abu Dhabi. When her father died suddenly, Jessica had returned home to care for her mother and younger sister, to hold her family together in the face of unimaginable loss. At the time, she had no idea that the price of that sacrifice would be her own sense of worth. She had worked so hard to prove that she was more than the color of her skin, more than the servant job she had taken to pay the bills. But no matter how many degrees she earned or how many applications she sent, it had always felt as if the door to true success was never fully open to her. She had been passed over, rejected, and ignored by the very institutions that should have recognized her potential. The doors had closed again and again, and for a long time, Jessica had wondered if they would ever open. But today, in that conference room, the door had finally cracked open. She had forced it to, with her words, with her skill, with her ability. She had earned her seat at the table, and the respect she had been denied for so long had been thrust into the open, even if only for a moment. But was it enough? Was it enough to undo the years of prejudice, to heal the scars that had been carved into her soul by rejection and disdain? She wasn't sure. What she did know was that the victory she had won today was only one battle in a war that had been fought for centuries. It was a victory she had claimed not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been overlooked because of their race, their gender, their background. As the elevator doors opened on the top floor, Jessica stepped out, the weight of her thoughts still lingering in her chest. She didn't want to spend another moment trapped in the clutches of self-doubt. She couldn't afford to. The battle she had just fought was not hers alone. She carried the weight of everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. When she entered the conference room again, the eyes of the men inside were different. Some watched her with newfound respect. Others, like Tucker, still held their gaze with a simmering contempt. But Jessica didn't care. She had made her mark. The world had seen her, and though it might have been fleeting, it was real. She took a seat at the table once more, her back straight, her hands resting calmly on the table. The conversation resumed, but Jessica was no longer an observer. She was an equal, an integral part of the discussion. And though she knew the road ahead would be long, with more battles to fight, she felt something stir inside her, a quiet strength, an unspoken confidence. In that moment, Jessica understood something that had eluded her for years. Mardomly, the true measure of a person's worth was not in the recognition of others, but in their own belief in themselves. The world might never fully acknowledge her, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that she now knew her own value, and with that, she leaned forward, ready to face whatever came next. The meeting stretched on for what seemed like hours. But Jessica remained grounded in the rhythm of the conversation. She could feel Tucker's eyes burning holes into the back of her head, but she didn't let it affect her. She had risen in the ranks not by the graces of anyone at this table, but by the sheer force of her knowledge, and nothing, not even Tucker's bitter gaze, could erase that. Her thoughts, however, weren't entirely consumed by the dynamics of the boardroom. They occasionally drifted to the past, to the years she had spent struggling to make herself known, to prove her worth in a world that seemed designed to make her invisible. The scars from that struggle had been deep, But today she could feel them beginning to fade. Not entirely, the fight was never over, but enough to let her breathe a little easier. She could hear the faint murmur of conversation around her as the discussion turned back to the specifics of the contract. Walker's voice was firm, confident now, and Jessica could sense the shift in the room. There was a quiet undercurrent of respect, but not just for her intellect. There was a new, deeper acknowledgement of her right to be there. The Sadiq, ever the quiet observer, was also a part of this change. He wasn't the kind of man who handed out praise lightly. His words, when they came, carried weight. "Miss Brown," he said, his voice smooth and measured, "I believe your solution addresses the problem. This contract will now be a true partnership, not one based on the idea of control, but on mutual respect." The simplicity of his statement hit Jessica harder than she expected. It wasn't just that he was agreeing with her. It was that he was agreeing in a way that made it clear he understood her struggle and, more importantly, her value. She wasn't just the token black woman who'd been thrust into this position by circumstance. She was someone who had earned her place. The room, still abuzz with conversation, seemed to fade into the background as she allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about her father once more, a man who had worked tirelessly to provide for his family. Only to have everything come crashing down when the financial crisis hit. Jessica had been there, standing beside him as he watched their lives unravel, and though she had tried to rise above it, to find a new path, the shadows of those days still lingered. She had done it all. She had fought the system, faced rejection after rejection, and still she had risen. It wasn't just the degrees, the accolades, the positions she had held that defined her. It was the years of invisible labor, the silent battles fought in dark corners. The moments when she was told she wasn't enough, but still carried on. And now here she was, sitting at a table that had once felt so far out of reach, surrounded by people who had no idea what it took for her to get here. Walker's voice interrupted her thoughts again. "Miss Brown," he said, "I think it's time we finalize the agreement. We've covered the major concerns, and it seems like we're ready to move forward." Jessica nodded, her mind sharpening once more. The fight wasn't over, but this chapter was closing. She had not only proven her worth, but had also reshaped the narrative for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. As the meeting began to wrap up, the tension in the room was palpable. The deal was close, so close Jessica could almost taste it. But even with the deal almost signed, something lingered, a quiet unease that she couldn't shake. She had won, but she wasn't naive enough to think that the world was going to change overnight. There would be more moments like this, where her worth would be questioned, where she would have to prove herself again. But she was ready for that, for Jessica had long ago stopped waiting for others to give her permission to exist in the spaces she deserved to occupy. She would take them, and if anyone doubted her, she would prove them wrong, again and again, if need be. The Sadiq, ever composed, rose to his feet and extended his hand toward Walker. The two men exchanged a firm handshake, the unspoken agreement between them solidifying with the touch. Then the Sadiq turned to Jessica. "Miss Brown," he said with quiet respect, "I want to thank you again. Without your clarity, we would have missed an opportunity for real collaboration. I am pleased to have you on this project." Jessica stood slowly, meeting his gaze. "Thank you, Your Highness," she replied, her voice steady, but with a warmth that hadn't been there before. This was more than just a professional acknowledgement. It was a recognition of her as a person, not just a function, not just a worker, but as someone who had earned the right to sit at this table, as a peer, as an equal. The room shifted again, and as Jessica turned to leave, she caught Tucker's gaze. His eyes were still filled with simmering resentment, But there was something different now. He wasn't the same man he had been earlier in the day. Jessica had exposed his flaws, his biases, and now he had no choice but to reckon with them. But Jessica didn't feel the satisfaction of revenge. No, it was something deeper. Something that came from within. She knew that her victory was about more than winning a deal. It was about making a statement, one that no one would forget. As she stepped out of the room, the weight of the day's events pressed on her, but in a way that felt like freedom. She had fought the good fight, and though the battle was far from over, she had proven something to herself. Something that could never be taken away. For the first time in a long while, Jessica Brown felt truly seen. The hum of the hotel faded as Jessica walked through the hallway, her footsteps steady and sure. Her thoughts weren't consumed by the weight of what had just transpired, but by the realization that her life had irrevocably shifted. She had fought for this moment, not just for the recognition in that boardroom, but for something far more profound. She had fought to reclaim the space that had always been hers. Only denied by a society that wasn't ready to see her, to acknowledge her worth. She passed by several staff members on her way to the elevator. Their eyes briefly meeting hers before they looked away. For a moment, it was as if the world had returned to its old rhythm. The rhythm where she was invisible again. But she knew now that she would never slip back into that quiet, unremarkable space again. Not after today, not after forcing the world to see her, to hear her. Her fingers brushed the cool metal of the elevator button as she waited for the doors to open. She had never felt more in tune with herself. The world might have tried to erase her, to make her just another face in a sea of faces. But now she was something more. She was the woman who had broken the chains of invisibility, who had proven herself not only to the men in that room, but to the girl she used to be, the one who had never believed she would get the chance to show the world her worth. The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside. The familiar, soft chime of the elevator as it began its descent seemed almost soothing now. A gentle reminder that the fight, though hard fought, had been won for today. She leaned back against the polished walls of the elevator. The faint tremor of exhaustion beginning to creep into her body. But there was no regret, no second guessing. In that moment, as the elevator descended toward the lobby, Jessica understood something fundamental about herself. She had always believed that the fight for equality, for respect, had been about winning over others, convincing them of her worth. But now she saw that the real battle had always been with herself. The moment she had let go of the fear, the moment she had believed, without a shadow of doubt, that she was worthy, was the moment that everything had shifted. The elevator reached the lobby floor with a soft jolt, and Jessica stepped out, moving through the crowd of well-dressed patrons who barely noticed her as she walked past. The clink of glasses, the low murmur of voices, the bustle of business meetings and casual conversations, all of it felt distant, as if she were standing at the edge of the world. The weight of the day seemed to lift slightly as she crossed the threshold into the hotel's quiet, opulent lobby. But then, as her gaze swept across the room, she saw him. Raymond Tucker stood near the bar, his back rigid, his arms crossed. The disdain in his posture was palpable, his eyes still filled with anger. Jessica knew that look. It was the look of a man who had been humiliated, who could no longer rely on the tools of his privilege to maintain control. His gaze met hers for a brief, searing moment, and she felt a flicker of satisfaction, not because she wanted revenge, but because he could no longer dismiss her. He had seen her worth, and it had unsettled him, but there was no pleasure in it for her. Jessica had never been the kind of person to take joy in the downfall of others, especially not in the fall of someone as entrenched in their own ego as Tucker. The truth was, she had already won. She didn't need him to acknowledge it. She didn't need his validation. She had proved something far more important. Riddance, that her value was not determined by the opinions of others. No matter how powerful or influential they might be. Jessica walked past him, the space between them charged with the tension of everything left unspoken. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge her, but she could feel the weight of his stare as she passed. It didn't matter, not anymore. She stepped outside into the crisp night air, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. The city, alive with the hum of activity, seemed almost foreign now. As if she were seeing it through a different lens. The familiar streets, the towering buildings, the crowds of people moving in every direction, it was all part of the world she had fought to be seen in. The world she had just begun to carve a space in. Jessica took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It was a peace that came not from external validation, but from the quiet knowledge that she had found her place. She didn't need to be a part of this world. She didn't need to prove herself to anyone else. All that mattered was the recognition she had finally given herself. She was worthy. She was capable, and she had made it. She walked down the street, the noise of the city bustling around her. But her mind was quiet. She thought about the future, about the choices she had to make. There would be more battles ahead, more people who would try to diminish her, to put her back in a box. But Jessica was no longer the woman who would be invisible. She would not be confined by the expectations of others. As she walked, a small smile curled at the corner of her lips. There would always be the Tuckers of the world, but she no longer had the weight of their judgments holding her down. The only weight that mattered now was the one she carried herself, the weight of her own belief in who she was and what she could accomplish. And that was enough. The weeks that followed were a blur of contracts, meetings, and negotiations. Jessica found herself not just participating in the conversations, but leading them with a quiet authority that seemed to demand attention without asking for it. Every room she entered, every table she sat at, became a space where her voice was heard, where her ideas were not just considered, but sought after. And yet, no matter how many times she walked into a room with the weight of her expertise firmly anchored in her chest, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, something that went beyond the negotiations and beyond the deals. She had spent years fighting to be seen, but now that she was seen, she had to reckon with what it meant to truly exist in the world that had long denied her. Her identity, once shaped by the absence of recognition, was now being molded by its presence. And in that process, Jessica was learning just how fragile the system of power and privilege could be, how quickly the walls of prejudice could come crumbling down when someone finally had the courage to stand tall and face them. And still, in the quiet corners of her mind, Jessica couldn't forget Raymond Tucker's gaze, filled with contempt yet underlined by something else. Fear, perhaps. He had been so sure of himself, so confident in his position, but her presence, her challenge, had shaken him. There had been no catharsis in his defeat, no moment of understanding, only the bitter sting of being caught in a lie he had spent a lifetime living. Jessica could feel the rage in his eyes every time they crossed paths in the hotel halls, his silence louder than any words he could muster. It was the silence of someone who could no longer pretend they had control. And that silence, that refusal to acknowledge her power, became a quiet victory for Jessica. It reminded her that her success wasn't tied to the validation of people like Tucker. It never had been. She had walked into that room with nothing but her knowledge, her experience, and her dignity. And in the end, it was those things that had made her a force. But as the days passed, Jessica's thoughts drifted to a different corner of her life. Her mother, whose health had been failing for years, had grown more frail with each passing month. Jessica had been juggling the demands of her career with the weight of caregiving, and as much as she hated to admit it, the pressure was starting to show. Her work, though rewarding, had become an escape from the quiet dread that filled her home when she wasn't there. From the fragility of her mother's health that seemed to worsen with each new visit to the hospital. The gap between her professional success and her personal life felt vast. And in the quiet moments, when she wasn't speaking in contracts or boardroom lingo, Jessica had to confront the truth that she was alone in this. She had always been alone. Her sister, a bright young woman with dreams of her own, was off pursuing her degree in another state, leaving Jessica to carry the burden of everything. Her father, too, was gone. The stability that had once anchored her family had been swept away in the chaos of life's unforgiving tides, and Jessica, as much as she had achieved, felt that weight pressing on her shoulders with an intensity she couldn't quite shake. It was in the midst of this turmoil that she received a call from her mother's doctor. The news was not unexpected, but it still hit her like a blow to the gut. Her mother's condition had taken a turn for the worse. The doctor spoke in clinical terms, and Jessica listened quietly, her mind racing. She had been preparing herself for this moment for years, but nothing could have prepared her for the raw emptiness that followed the call. Her mother wasn't just sick, she was fading, slipping away in a way that felt irreversible. Jessica hung up the phone, her hand trembling as she set it down. She stood there for a moment, staring at nothing, her thoughts a blur. The weight of everything seemed to settle around her like a heavy fog. In that instant, the grand accomplishments, the deals, the victories in the boardroom, they felt so small, so insignificant. What did it matter that she had earned her place at the table when the one person who had always supported her, always believed in her, was no longer there in the way she needed? The truth of her life had always been that she was the pillar, the one holding everything together. But now, she realized with a painful clarity, she wasn't sure how much longer she could hold it all up. She had spent so much time fighting the world, proving her worth to everyone else, that she had forgotten to take care of herself, to tend to the things that truly mattered. The truth was stark, and it was painful. The fight for respect and equality, while necessary, had come at the expense of the very relationships she had once valued the most. And yet, even in the depths of this sorrow, something inside her stirred. A quiet voice, deep within, reminded her that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. She had already weathered storms that would have broken most people. She had faced a world that told her she didn't belong, and she had stood her ground. This was just another storm. She had to find a way to balance the weight of the world with the love she had for her family, the love she had for herself. But for the moment, Jessica allowed herself to grieve. She allowed herself the space to feel the weight of the pain, the weight of loss, and the weight of responsibility. She needed this moment. She needed to pause. And as she stood there in the quiet of her apartment, the city lights flickering softly in the distance, she realized that the next part of her journey wasn't going to be about the deals or the recognition. It was about finding peace, finding balance, and finding the courage to let go of the weight that had burdened her for so long. The next morning, after a restless night, Jessica made her decision. She would continue to fight, continue to rise in the world of finance. But she would also take time for herself, for her family. She would not let the demands of success steal from the relationships that had always grounded her. As she stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her suit before heading to another meeting, she caught a glimpse of the woman who had fought so hard to be seen. And she realized, perhaps for the first time, that the fight for respect had never been just about others seeing her. It was about her seeing herself. The days that followed were filled with a quiet reflection Jessica hadn't allowed herself in years. The harsh pace of her career, the never-ending meetings, the swirl of high-stakes negotiations, it all seemed so distant now, like the low hum of a machine that had started to lose its power. Jessica had come to understand that while the world had its expectations, she had her own, and those expectations, for so long molded by others, were now taking a shape that felt more honest, more real. But reality, as always, wasn't without its trials. Her mother's health continued to deteriorate, a slow, unrelenting tide that no amount of professional success could halt. Jessica would spend her days at the hospital, talking to doctors, sitting beside her mother's bed. But even those moments felt like they were slipping away. The woman who had once been a pillar of strength, who had kept their family together through the darkest of times, was now fading. Jessica didn't know how much longer she could stand in the shadow of that loss. But she refused to let it break her. The work at Pinnacle, too, continued to demand her attention. She had assumed the role of senior financial advisor on the billion-dollar project, her ideas shaping the future of a city, the landscape of development that would reshape the skyline of Manhattan. And still, the same forces she had always fought against remained present. There were people who doubted her, not because of her abilities, but because of her race, her gender. Raymond Tucker was still there, lurking in the background, his every glance a silent challenge. For him, his refusal to acknowledge her success was as much a part of the landscape as the financial contract she had been so instrumental in crafting. Jessica had learned to let go of the need for approval. She no longer needed Tucker's respect, nor anyone else's. She had earned her place, and that was enough. The nights were the hardest, when the world fell quiet, and the solitude of her apartment seemed to fill with the weight of everything. But in those moments, Jessica found something that had eluded her for so long: peace. The kind of peace that didn't come from external validation, from the applause of a crowded room, or the admiration of those who had once dismissed her. It came from within, from the simple truth that she had fought for what was hers, right? And in doing so, had created a space where she could finally exist as herself, without apology. And in the quiet of the night, when the city outside was still, and the light from the street lamps cast long shadows across the floor, allowed herself to breathe. She allowed herself to feel the weight of all that had been lost, but also to feel the weight of all that had been gained. It was in those moments that she thought about her father, about his work, his dreams. She had inherited his drive, his refusal to give up in the face of adversity. He had been the one who taught her that success wasn't just about the destination. It was about the journey, the choices we made along the way. He had never been able to finish what he had started, but Jessica, in her quiet way, had picked up where he had left off. She had not only fought for her place in this world, but she had fought to carry his legacy forward, to honor the sacrifices he had. The future, however, was uncertain. Jessica knew that there would be more battles, more moments when she would have to prove herself, more people who would try to undermine her. The world she had entered was a tough one, full of people who had built their lives on systems of privilege and power. But she also knew that there was a strength in her that could not be diminished. No matter what happened, no matter what came next, she had already won. In the coming weeks, Jessica would continue to fight the silent battles that came with her newfound position. There would be meetings where she would be the only woman, the only person of color, where her ideas would be challenged. Not for their worth, but for the simple fact that they came from someone like her. She would continue to face people like Tucker, who would try to undermine her, to bring her back to the place where they thought she belonged. But Jessica had come to understand something fundamental. Their opinions didn't matter. Her worth was not defined by them, not by their approval, not by their judgments. It was defined by what she had already accomplished, by the person she had become. The Jessica Brown who had once been invisible was no longer the woman standing in the background, waiting for others to give her a place. She had made her place. She had earned it. And so, as the days passed and the world continued to turn, Jessica's resolve remained strong. She had built something that couldn't be taken away from her. Not the approval of men like Tucker, not the judgments of a society that had long made her invisible. What she had built was not just a career, it was a sense of self, a belief in her own worth that no one could ever erase. When the final agreements for the $1 billion project were signed, Jessica felt a quiet satisfaction, not because she had secured the deal, but because she had done it on her terms. She had faced down the challenges, the doubts, the prejudice, and she had emerged stronger. And with that strength, she knew she could face whatever came next. The fight, after all, was never just about the money, the deals, or the titles. It was about finding the courage to be yourself, to claim your space in a world that constantly tried to deny you. Jessica had fought for her place at the table, but she had also fought for the right to sit at it as herself, unafraid, unashamed, and unstoppable. Jessica's life, once defined by struggle and invisibility, was slowly being remade. Every step she took now seemed more deliberate, more purposeful. Right, as though the ground beneath her feet had finally solidified. She was no longer the uncertain young woman who had first walked into that room at the Westwood Hotel, carrying trays of coffee, while her mind roamed far beyond the confines of her job. No longer was she defined by the invisible barriers that had been placed before her, barriers of race, gender, and class. She had shattered them, not with force, but with patience, intelligence, and an unwavering belief in her own worth. And yet, as she stood in the quiet of her office late one evening, the city's lights flickering outside her window, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. She had fought for this success, this place at the table, and had earned the respect of the men and women who once overlooked her. But what was success if it wasn't shared with those who had always supported her? The ache of longing for her mother, who lay in a hospital room far too often these days, the weight of caring for a family in shambles, it all lingered in the background of her triumphs. Success had never been a solitary pursuit for Jessica. It was always a collective dream, a family dream. And now, standing alone in the warmth of her office, the glow of her accomplishments seemed a little colder, less fulfilling. Jessica had always believed that recognition from the world would fill the emptiness left by personal loss. But the more she achieved, the more she found herself staring at the truth. The world she had fought so hard to be a part of was cold, fleeting. It wasn't the applause, the titles, or even the billion-dollar deal that gave her meaning. It was the quiet moments, the small acts of love and understanding that had always sustained her. As she prepared for another meeting the next morning, the weight of her responsibilities shifted in her chest. She had already proven herself to the world, but to her family, to her mother, who had sacrificed everything to make sure Jessica had a future, to her sister, who had been left to pursue her own dreams while Jessica was forced to carry the burden alone. Jessica was left wondering if she had done enough for the people who had made it possible for her to even dream. The next day, as she stepped into the boardroom once more, the familiar faces of her colleagues, greeted her. Walker, who had once looked at her with curiosity and skepticism, now offered a respectful nod. The Sadiq, still sharp and composed, offered her a brief smile of acknowledgment. They were all there in that room to discuss the final stages of the $1 billion development project. But this time something was different. Jessica was no longer a participant in the deal. She was the architect of it. Her ideas, her strategy, her vision for the future of this project were now central to its success. And yet, in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the work ahead would not only be measured by the projects she could shape, the deals she could seal. It would be measured by the relationships she could heal, the bonds she could rebuild. The world could see her for her accomplishments, but could it see her for who she was? The discussion began, the usual back and forth of ideas and strategies filling the room. But Jessica felt detached. It wasn't that she wasn't listening, or that she had lost interest in the work at hand. No, it was that she had already made peace with the fact that her life had to be more than just the work. She had to find a way to balance the world of high finance with the world of family, with the part of herself that had been forced into hiding for so long. She had to heal the parts of herself that had been broken by a lifetime of systemic disregard. As the meeting wrapped up and the final details of the project were discussed, Jessica stood up, her mind still clouded with the weight of her thoughts. Walker, who had become an unexpected ally, looked at her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. "Miss Brown," he said, his tone thoughtful, "I think we've reached the final stage of this project. We couldn't have done it without your expertise." Jessica met his gaze, offering a modest nod. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. I appreciate the opportunity to work on this." But her thoughts were elsewhere, no longer tied to the room, the project, or the people around her. They were with her mother, with the quiet ache in her heart that could never be filled by the recognition of the world. She had fought so hard to be seen, but in doing so, she had forgotten that it was the people closest to her who had always seen her for who she truly was, not just for her achievements, but for her love, her sacrifices, and her resilience. Later that day, as Jessica sat in her office preparing for another round of meetings, she made a decision. She would continue to build this career, this legacy, but she would do so with a balance she hadn't known before. She would make time for her family, for the quiet moments that had always grounded her. She would fight for the recognition she deserved, but she would also fight for the relationships that mattered most. And in that quiet decision, something shifted inside her. Jessica Brown was no longer the woman who had fought to prove her worth. She was the woman who had found it, not in the approval of others, not in the accolades, but in the quiet knowing that she was enough. The following weeks unfolded with a certain calm Jessica hadn't known in a long time. She continued her work with Pinnacle Investments, overseeing the final details of the $1 billion project, making crucial decisions with the precision and insight that had earned her the title of Senior Financial Advisor. But now, it wasn't just the power of the numbers or the force of her intellect that propelled her forward. It was a quieter strength, a deeper resolve, born from the understanding that success, true success, was not measured by the titles on paper or the accolades bestowed by others. She found herself balancing meetings with moments at home, sitting with her mother in the sterile quiet of hospital rooms, where time seemed to stretch and bend in ways that couldn't be captured by a schedule or deadline. Her mother's health continued to decline, each visit marked by a fleeting hope that, perhaps today, she would feel better, would sit up, would speak. But Jessica knew better now. The truth of the matter was that her mother, the woman who had given everything to keep their family afloat, was slipping away, and no amount of business success, no matter how much money and power it brought, could stop that. But Jessica had made peace with it. Her mother had always been the cornerstone of her life, the one constant amid all the turbulence. And now Jessica could give back. She could be the one to sit by her mother's side, to hold her hand, to offer the kind of comfort that only she could. She could stand firm in the knowledge that while she had fought for her place in the world, the fight that mattered most was the one for love, for connection, for the people who had shaped her. Even as she balanced the weight of her mother's health and the world of high finance, Jessica felt a deep sense of gratitude. It was the people who had been with her through it all. Her sister, her mother, even Emily at the Westwood Hotel, who had made this success possible. These were the relationships that had always mattered most. The ones that had nurtured her, even when the world had tried to break her down. In the midst of her personal struggles, Jessica had grown. She had moved past the need to prove herself to others. She had built a legacy not just for herself but for the generations that would come after her. Or her success was no longer just about achieving financial milestones or sitting at the table with men like Walker and the Sadiq. It was about being a role model for those who would follow, a testament to the strength that comes when one finally believes in their worth. But there were still moments when Jessica would feel that old doubt creeping in, a reminder of the years spent as an outsider, fighting to be seen. Tucker's presence, though now a distant memory, still lingered like a shadow. She had defeated him, yes, but his anger, his disdain, had left an imprint that she couldn't easily erase. There were days when she would catch herself wondering if, in his quiet resentment, he had ever truly seen her, or if she had simply been a challenge for him to overcome, a woman who had dared to exist in spaces that were never meant for her. It was in these moments of doubt that Jessica turned inward. She closed her eyes and remembered the moment when she had stood up in that room, when she had spoken in perfect Arabic and corrected the miscommunication that had nearly destroyed a $1 billion deal. In that moment, she hadn't needed anyone's approval. She had acted on what she knew, on the quiet strength that had always been inside her, and in the stillness of her mind, she understood that this was her true victory. It wasn't just about proving others wrong. It was about proving to herself that she was enough, that her voice, her mind, her heart had value, no matter who chose to see it. One evening, as she sat beside her mother's bed, holding her frail hand, Jessica made another quiet decision. She would not be consumed by the weight of others' judgments anymore. She had spent too many years waiting for the world to recognize her worth. Now, she would give that recognition to herself. She would create a life that was defined not by what she could achieve, but by who she was becoming. A woman who had been torn down but had risen again. A woman who had fought for the world to see her, but had come to understand that it was her own perception of herself that truly mattered. Jessica's mind, once dominated by the need to succeed and the fear of failure, was now at peace. She no longer needed to chase after success for validation. She had already achieved it, not in the eyes of others, but in the quiet certainty that she was living a life that aligned with her values, her truth. Her mother, though weak, squeezed her hand with a faint smile, and Jessica smiled back, feeling a deep sense of love and gratitude for the woman who had given her everything. The battle for the recognition of others was over. What mattered now was the love and peace she had found within herself, and the ability to stand firm in that truth. As she looked out the window at the city below, the same city that had once felt so distant and inaccessible, Jessica felt a quiet triumph. She had found her place in it, not through the validation of others, but through her own inner strength, her own belief in her worth. She had fought for this life, and now, for the first time in years, she was truly living it. The woman, the boy, the man, the soldier who knows his worth does not chase after money, fame, or choice. They walk in the world, unbowed, unafraid, and their place in it is already secured. Thank you for watching this story on Shoe Stories. If it moved you, taught you something, or made you rethink the meaning of silence, please hit the like button, subscribe to our channel, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your voice matters. Let it be heard quietly or loudly, and don't go anywhere. Click on one of the videos showing on your screen to watch more powerful stories about dignity, justice, and unshakable. We'll see you in the next one.